I promise I'll sort the facial hair out soon. Now, my grandfather doesn't always say one when he means this number. He sometimes says jan. He doesn't always say find and found. He sometimes says find and fund. These are all obviously features of his regional dialect, which is the Cumbrian dialect spoken in the northwestern corner of England, just south of the Scottish border. And in this video I'm going to use the Cumbrian dialect as a vehicle for exploring the question of how could we possibly judge that one accent of English was older or more conservative than another. Let's start with this jan word for one, because I think it's an interesting example where the standard English and Cumbrian forms are so different that people don't really even think of it as a regional accent difference anymore. They just think that jan is the Cumbrian word for one. So we'll start with Old English in about 1000 AD. On,
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 an,
on,
an,
on,
an,
on,
an,
one,
an,
one,
an,
one,
ian,
one.
yan.
Now this wasn't standard mainstream Southern English all the way through. For a while it was a regional dialect of Southern English where a rising diphthong occurred in some of these words with this or vowel. So that's why we have one, and it no longer rhymes with words like goat and stone. Even as late as Shakespeare's time, in the kind of Southern Standard, one was pronounced orn, but of course that's not the form that survived into modern Standard English, so that's not the one that I followed. So how could you establish some comparison of which one of these is more conservative? In about 1300, the Northern English form was probably more conservative because it still had an unrounded low vowel, but by 1800, by the present day, they're pretty much just as different as each other from the Old English form, and in fact the Southern English form by happenstance has ended up slightly more phonetically similar because at least it still has a low back vowel, although it didn't keep the low back vowel from Old English, it kind of redeveloped it. So it's very difficult to reliably compare them. You could say that the Northern form is more conservative in that it still fits into the same lexical set as it did in Old English, because Cumbrian jan rhymes with Cumbrian stjan and bian, meaning stone and bone, whereas the modern English one doesn't rhyme with stone and bone anymore, so it now falls into a different vowel category. But again, that's just one of many possible ways of comparing these. So what about the second example I gave, the example of find and fund instead of find and found? Findon,
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 finden,
finde,
finde,
find,
fiend,
find,
feind,
find,
find.
find.
In this case it seems more obvious which form's most conservative. Cumbrian forms barely changed at all in about 600 years. The only way in which Northern English was more conservative at first is that it retained this short I vowel, where in Southern Old English it lengthened before a cluster of n and d. But in Northern Old English, this un infinitive ending on verbs gets reduced to just very early on. And indeed, in early Middle English, this final vowel disappears altogether in Northern English quite a long time before it disappears in Southern English. So at first, around sort of 1300, 1400, the Southern English form kind of seems more conservative in an impressionistic way. So are you judging by how many sound changes happened at what rate, or are you just judging by what the final forms of the words are in the more modern stages of the dialects? Another interesting case of conservative versus advanced is in the long vowels, which have changed quite a lot in all English dialects. Now for another example, let's have a look at the word leek. Lokion,
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 lokia,
loken,
loka,
loke,
lök,
lok,
lök,
luke,
lyk,
look.
lek.
In this case, I would say that Southern English is more conservative all the way through. For the first few hundred years, it retains this infinitive verb ending again where Northern English lost it. And then later on, it still retains a high-ish back quality with rounded lips for this vowel. Whereas in Northern English, again, it loses the infinitive ending very early on. And then, as it goes through the great vowel shift, the vowel has become completely fronted to a front tongue position. It's gone from O to Ö. And then eventually it's also lost its lip rounding, producing liek, which is produced with basically no lip rounding at all. This is one example of a Middle English long vowel which has changed a lot in Northern English, but there are also, of course, examples famously of Middle English long vowels that have barely changed in Northern English. Hús, 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 house, hús, house, hús. In this case, it's very clear that the Northern English form is more conservative. The only change that's really happened with the Northern English form is that it's diphthongized slightly from oo to oo, and that might have happened in the last 200 years, whereas the Southern form has undergone quite a large diphthongization ages ago. And this case is actually because of the previous case of the look vowel, that or in Middle English fronted in the north, and that left the back part of the vowel inventory very kind of barren. There was no upward pressure when all of the long vowels started to raise, and so in the north, this high oo vowel, as in hús, it just stayed where it was. It wasn't pressured to diphthongize in the way that it was in the south. So in this sense, where Northern English is advanced in one respect, it allows it to be conservative in another respect. So how could we actually do a systematic comparison? Well, I'll try one way to begin with, focusing on the vowels that were monophthongs in early Middle English around the year 1200, and a monophthong is a vowel with a stable quality that doesn't glide from one sound to another, like I or O, as opposed to O or OW, which are diphthongs. I'll put an addendum here if you want to pause to see how I'm counting. Let's start with the early Middle English short vowels. Cat, 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 letten, letter, letter, let, 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 lit, lit, bit, 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 lot, 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 bull, 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 bull. Now we hit a bit of a roadblock because in the 1600s our southern dialect developed an extra contrast between short vowels. The U in put split from the in cut, which didn't happen in the north. Kutten, kutte, kutte, kut, cut, kut, cut, kut. So not too much difference in the short vowels, with our Cumbrian dialect leaning towards being more conservative. The long vowels of early Middle English are where it's really at. Taken, take, take, tak, tek, tek, take, 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 take. Beten, bete, bete, bet, 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 beat, 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 beat. Feden, feder, feder, fed, feed, 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 feed. Beaten, beater, beater, beat, bait, bait, bite, bait, bite, bite. Bought, 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 bat, boat, bet, boat, bet, boat, bjat. Gås, 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 gös, goose, geese, goose, geese, goose, geese. Moose,
moose, moose, moose, mouse, moose, mouse, moose, mouse, moose. So by that extremely rudimentary measure that I cobbled together, it seems that our Cumbrian accent circa 1900 or 1910 is probably something like 10 or 15% more conservative than southeastern received pronunciation at that time. So why is it that there's this strong sense when we listen to, for many of us, there's this strong sense when we listen to reconstructions of Middle English or Old English, that it kind of sounds a lot more like a Northern English or a Scottish accent. And of course, as you get into early modern English, it starts to sound like an Irish accent. Well, I think it's because our brains are very efficient machines, and they work to do a very kind of quick and dirty job of telling us where someone's probably from and some assumptions we should make about them. And this, of course, often leads to prejudice, this leads to discriminatory ideas about people, and it's something that I think we should strive to overcome in a lot of cases. But it's our brain's way of just trying to efficiently, stereotyping basically. It's our brain's way of very efficiently trying to work out some information that might be true about someone. And this includes where they're from. And so our brains, as we're growing up, pick up on the things that are very important in telling what someone's accent is, where they might be from. And, these markers of accent, which are very important, will change over time. So, for example, in the 1600s in England, whether somebody pronounced the r in a word like cart, was probably not very important in determining where they were from, because there were, very few or none at all of the non-rhotic speakers that now dominate speech in England. So my accent, where I don't pronounce the r in cart, didn't exist back then. And so whether somebody pronounced the r in a word like cart was not a very meaningful accent feature back then, because everyone did it. And so people's brains back then probably didn't consider that a relevant thing in determining what someone's accent was. Nowadays it's a lot more important, because if you're from most of England today, or Australia, or a lot of New Zealand, or South Africa, or parts of the US, you're likely to drop R's in that position. You're likely to not pronounce the r unless there's a vowel straight after it. Whereas if you're from most of Ireland, most of Scotland, most of the US, parts of New Zealand, then you are likely to pronounce the r pretty much wherever it's written. And so that's now something that our brains can immediately use as a marker. That's something our brains can immediately go, okay, I've massively narrowed down where this person must be from. And another thing is the pronunciation of that r sound, where it is pronounced, whether it's an approximate sound like I use, r, or whether it's a trill or a tap, ra, ra. That also massively clues you into where somebody might be from. If it's a trill or a tap, depending on your background and how much you know about different accents, you may assume that the person is probably Scottish. You might think that they might be from some part of Ireland where trills and taps are still used. You may think that they might be Northern English, or you might think that they might be, if they have trills and taps, especially taps, but they speak non-rhotically, you might think that they are a quite conservative southeastern English speaker, because people like Margaret Thatcher would use taps in between vowels. Very. I didn't do a very good job. Very, very, very. I can't do it on the fly. So that's another thing that massively clues the brain in immediately and narrows down, this is where the person's probably from. And so, because very conservative Northern English accents tend to use taps, ra, and they also tend to be at least partially rhotic in very old speakers and in old audio recordings, pronouncing the R in a word like water, meaning water. When we hear this in reconstructions of Middle English and Old English, our brains immediately have this massive bias towards thinking, where's that accent from? I think it's from maybe Scotland or Northern England or somewhere like that. And because these are such massive markers of accent in the modern Anglosphere, it causes this kind of almost this undue bias, this massive bias towards thinking that Middle English reconstructions sound like Scottish or sound like Northern English. But I don't think this is entirely unjustified, because as we've just shown, I think the long vowels, the short vowels, are slightly more conservative in Northern England. One of the things that's definitely more conservative is that the face vowel, for example, is still a monophthong for many or most Northern English speakers nowadays. It's still got a stable quality. It's not A like it is in my accent, but it's something more like E, face. And that's definitely a conservative feature that you will hear in recordings, reconstructions of early modern English, Middle English. Although in Middle English it's a much lower vowel, more like fas. And the goat vowel, as I pointed out, many words in that lexical set, boat, home, bone, had a rising diphthong in conservative Cumbrian. Biat, bian, yam, yan. But that is quite, I think it's fair to say that's quite rare nowadays. Pretty much everyone in Cumbria will know what yan means, or yam, but I don't know. I don't personally know anyone who says bian for bone anymore. You might know someone that does, but it's certainly something that's being supplanted by a more neutralised form that sounds more like the Southern English form. Something with a back mid-height rounded monophthong, something like bone, home, stone. And again, this sounds like early modern English. In reconstructions of London English from 1600, you'll have pronunciations like bone, stone, own. And so again, that's another thing that makes our brains think this sounds Northern English. So that's just a little bit of discussion on why we might have a little more bias towards thinking that they're very conservative when actually they're just slightly conservative. I'll mostly wrap up the video there, aside from to say that the development of this ya vowel in words like boat, one, stone, bone, becomes very complicated once you get north of a certain point within the north of England. It develops in a number of ways. When you get further into Scotland, it seems, I think, as though it's totally merged with the face vowel at some point in history, so that words like face have the same vowel as ain, stain, bane. As I said, in the part of Cumbria that I was focusing on, they're still distinct. And then the further south you go within that sort of northern region, especially in places like South Yorkshire, maybe Westmoreland as well, you start to see that the fleece and beat vowels aren't even merged. So I think in the film Kess from the 1960s, which is set in Barnsley, I think, you have characters that don't have the merger between the meat and the meat vowel, which affects the entire front half of the vowel system as well. The development that I presented in this video is certainly a simplification, and I'll probably do another video on that, explaining the nuances of it at some point soon, because I think it's very interesting. As for the sources that I've used to reconstruct these accents, I didn't want to include all of the explanation of how you reconstruct accents, because I've done that a number of times in different videos. But the main sources I used were these on screen. If you'd like to ask any specific questions about how any particular vowel was reconstructed, then feel free to ask in the comments, and I'll try to keep an eye on them.